What's up guys, my name is Colin, this channel is called The Battle Bridge, and today we're talking about Star Trek Picard Episode 5.
After they brought you back from your time in the collective, do you honestly feel that you regained your humanity?
Yes.
All of it?
No. But we're both working on it, aren't we?
Now, just so you guys know, this isn't going to be your typical episode review. We're not going to go over synopsis. We're not going to tell you things you already know. What I'm going to do is lump everything I liked and everything I didn't like into two different sections in the video. Things in this episode are either going to get a yup, which means I like them, or a nope, which means not feeling it. First thing that gets a yup from me is 7 of 9. We got a tiny taste of her in the last episode, but it's in episode 5 that she really comes to life as a guest character. We got a little fleshed out backstory. We got a more morally gray, dare I say, more human 7 of 9 than we're used to seeing. And yeah, the mere fact that she was actually in the episode, nice callback to Voyager, another gift for classic Trek fans. Speaking of 7 of 9, speaking of callbacks, speaking of Voyager, Icheb's inclusion in this episode was surprising to say the least, in a good way. Just like Hugh from a few episodes ago, this was an awesome inclusion of a character who, in the grand scheme of Star Trek, is pretty minor. Doing things like including Icheb and Hugh and these different characters, and obviously 7 of 9, isn't just fan service for fan service sake. It's connective tissue to the Star Trek universe. It helps make Picard feel like it's part of the same world that TNG, Voyager, DS9, TOS were. And this is really important for Picard, the show, because it's going in different directions than Treks of days past. So it can really benefit from those familial ties. Again, that connective tissue that communicates to us that, hey, this is the same Star Trek we know and love, even though this show is a little different. Along the same lines, Stardust City, which was a new location we got in this episode, is gonna get a yup from me. I don't think it was like an incredible location. I don't think it was particularly Star Trek, but what I did like about it is that for me, it was basically the rated R version of Risa. You remember in TNG especially when they would always talk about, sometimes actually go to Risa, the vacation planet, the planet where you cut loose, where anything happens, and it was so PG. It was Picard in a lawn chair reading a book. I always kind of imagined that Risa would have a seedy side. And I know that Stardust City is located on a different planet entirely, but still, I feel like it was kind of a direct callback to what Risa probably should have been. Speaking of characters coming out of the woodwork from Star Trek's past, forget about Voyager, we got Bruce Maddox in the flesh in this episode. The first time that, at least I'm aware of, that he's appeared as an actual character since what, season 2 of TNG? Now, I'm not going to spend this entire video giving a yup to all the returning characters. I'm going to give a little respect to the new ones too. Captain Rios, for one, I thought was awesome in this episode, and I haven't really been a huge fan of his character until now. He's been playing this sort of like stoic, badass, you know, ex-Federation, got wounded once, never going to open his heart again type of guy, and it got a little old, even like a couple episodes in. To see him cut loose and play that, well, basically like a pimp character on Stardust City, gave him a little bit of personality, fleshed out his character, made him feel more like a real person. They took the opportunity to give the same treatment to Raffi. Now, her character's been pretty good, and we got a bit of a backstory with her and Picard's relationship, so I didn't feel like she was quite as one-dimensional as Rios, but the whole dynamic with her son, the drug addiction, abandoning him, again, makes her feel like a real person, like a character who's had decades of life history and life experience before the show started. Now, speaking of everything that happened on Stardust City, at first I didn't really know how to feel about the silly costumes, the stupid accents, the role-playing. It came off a little at first, but you know what I realized? We basically just watched the Picard equivalent of a holodeck episode. Now, holodeck episodes, generally speaking, are among my least favorite, at least when it comes to TNG, but you can't deny that they're sort of a beloved subgenre of Trek at this point. And although we didn't actually go into a holodeck, although none of this was made up by a computer, it was fantasy. There were people playing parts. They were putting on, again, silly accents. It was ridiculous, frankly, but again, when you think of it as a modern day holodeck episode, I'm going to give this one a yup instead of a nope. Finally, on a slightly more serious note, I really like the direction they took Picard, the character, in this episode. In my criticism of the last episode, I said that I felt he was acting a little unlike the Jean-Luc Picard we know and love, specifically in regards to the sort of friendly grandpa or lovable uncle, or, befuddled old man persona that he seems to be slipping into in certain episodes. Well, in this one, aside from playing a French pirate, he was very classic Jean-Luc Picard, at least in my opinion. He was morally superior, lecturing Seven of Nine on being a vigilante and taking the law into her own hands. He was giving orders, clearly sort of assuming the captain role on the ship, even though that Rios is her captain and Picard is actually just a civilian. And mixing moments of tenderness or understanding or being emotionally vulnerable with moments of being a fucking badass. Again, thus far, I think Patrick Stewart has done a great job of playing the character he's so well known for, and I do think that at least in season 1 of this show, the whole thing's going to be carried by him, which means it is of vital importance that we don't lose sight of what the character of Jean-Luc Picard actually is. Yes, it's been, decades since we saw him, at least 15 years, but that doesn't mean that he's a completely different person. And I'm glad to see that the show isn't taking that character and running away with him in a direction that is totally unfamiliar to us. Now, that was a lot of elements in the yup category of Picard episode 5, but there were a handful of things that I did not care for when it came to this episode. Number 1 was that insane opening. That is going to get a note from me. I said in my review of episode 2 that the flashback opening was more like a horror movie than Star Trek, and I said I liked it. Now, you could say the same thing about the opening for episode 5, but I do feel it crossed a line. It was so violent, so bloody, so sort of traumatic, gratuitously so. I know that Picard is a sort of edgier Trek, a more modern Trek, a Trek in the Game of Thrones mentality, so to speak, but it still has to be Star Trek, and man, ripping out someone's eyeballs while they're screaming and blood is spurting everywhere, that's just not Star Trek. Sorry. I like the idea of it, the plot point of Seven of Nine rescuing Icheb and her past with Bjayzl, but come on, did we have to go full torture porn? The opening of this episode is going to get a nope from me. I also said that I liked the locale of Stardust City. One thing I didn't like was when Captain Rios' ship approached the planet, they were bombarded with ads. It was basically the Star Trek equivalent of pop-up ads when you get to a sketchy website. Now that concept in and of itself is good, it's funny. But what I didn't like was the execution. They had all these sort of 3D rendered holographic models who appeared in different ads to the characters. And it kind of took me out of Trek, if I'm being honest. The reason for that is just kind of how low rent and how cheap looking the CGI was. And here's the problem with that. You can't use bad CGI the way they used it in a science fiction show. Because if it looks bad to us, how are we meant to believe that it is cutting edge technology, or at least acceptable looking for the 24th century? Look, it's different when Star Trek does a new alien they're encountering and it's kind of like a bad CGI ball of energy, right? We can suspend our disbelief a little easier because that's a being that we've never seen before, that humans have never encountered before, and it's difficult to conceive of what it might look like. Maybe it would look like bad CGI, but in this case, this is sort of a real human thing. This is advertising. This is like the Stardust City equivalent of a billboard. So if it looks as cheesy and as low rent graphically as these look, it takes you out of the fantasy. It makes you just think, ooh, the CGI budget for Picard maybe isn't so good. To fix this scene, I think they could have done 2 things. Number 1, just leave it on the cutting room floor. It's not essential. It's played for comedy. Number 2, make it so that the holograms are hyper-realistic, like what you'd see in a holodeck, like what you already see with the EMH on board Rios' ship. Why didn't they just do that? Anyways, the whole scene is just going to get a note from me, because I also didn't think the humor landed very well either. Speaking of which, I'm still not a huge fan of Elrond. I mean, Elnor. Yes, I still don't think he really looks or acts like he belongs in a Star Trek universe, and though I do appreciate in episode 5 they played him for laughs, which gave his character a much needed second dimension from the last episode, I actually don't think he came off particularly funny. I'm sorry, but the Lord of the Rings elf in space still gets a nope from me. Finally, I was a bit creeped out by Dr. Jurati and Maddox's relationship. Maddox is very much older than Jurati, and we also know from what she said that he recruited her directly out of school. So this relationship is basically between a boss and an employee, or the power dynamic might be a little bit more like a professor and a student. Either way, given that power dynamic and their age gap, I found it a little creepy. So this is going to get a soft note from me, although I do acknowledge that there may be more to it, especially given the shocking ending of episode 5 when it came to those two. In summary, if we can just chill on the violence just a little bit, I'll be happy. And we can work on Elnor. I believe his character can get there.